Can we give a warm welcome to David Bell? So David Bell.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very kind welcome. You might imagine it's been quite an exciting weekend after the Queen's Birthday Honours, but one of the little-known facts about being KCB is that you have the right to have your children, if they so wish, married in Westminster Abbey. So my two daughters immediately seized on this point. I did suggest to them that whilst my title might have changed, my name hasn't changed to Middleton, so they can dream on, and if they want to do it, they can pay for it themselves. It's a great opportunity to be here to just say a little bit about the policy context that we face at the moment. And I will say a little bit about that in a moment or two, but I thought by way of preamble, I would just remind you what the current coalition government sees as its mission for education. It believes very strongly in a more highly educated society in which access to educational opportunity is not determined by background or family circumstances. And I think what that's intended to capture is a commitment to educational excellence alongside a very strong commitment to social mobility. And this is not just, well, is that the Conservative side of the coalition thinking this, and is that the Liberal Democrat side of the coalition thinking that? I think it's a genuinely heartfelt view on the part of the government in both its dimensions. So, excellence and equity. You might think, oh, I've heard those words before. Did the previous government not commit itself to excellence and equity? Do most governments not commit themselves to excellence and equity? And I think as we go through, we might understand a bit more what this particular government sees as its priorities in promoting educational excellence and securing equity. The other, by way of introduction, comments I would make are really to do with the kind of philosophy or mindset of the government. And this is actually really quite important to understand. When in this country we've become more used to administrations of the same party for a long period of time, you get used to the kind of expectations that they bring. You get used to the way they do business. So the previous administration, obviously working in different economic circumstances, that has to be said, to the current administration, believed that a strong role for government when it came to education, quite a lot of central direction, quite a lot of promoting a whole set of particular outcomes, supporting those with guidance, field forces to make things happen, sometimes inspecting arrangements tailored to meet particular priorities. Now, of course, some of what I've described there continues under this administration, because all governments have to have an interest in education. We spend £60 billion a year of public money on education. So when people say, let's get politics out of education, actually politics will never be out of education as long as we spend that sort of public money on education. But the important issue here is that the current government believes that it wants to step as far back as it can from central direction, central prescription, and, as they would argue, leave head teachers and teachers to get on with the job. Secretary often says head teachers and teachers should be determining what goes on in schools, not whisper it, politicians and bureaucrats. Now you might argue that, well, yes, but the government still wanted us to do this or wanted us to do that, and again, that will be true. But I think you will have already seen much more of a stepping back in lots of important areas. And alongside that, there was attempts, I'll say a little bit more this now, to create much more autonomy within the system, so that schools can choose to maximise the amount of freedom that they have at their disposal. So, important to remind yourself of the core mission of the government, and important to remind yourself of sort of underpinning principles of what the government wants to do. In terms of big priority areas, let me identify three quickly, just say a little bit about each, and then we can open it up for questions. The first issue to touch on is raising standards and closing attainment gaps. And I think the way in which the government would anticipate this happening is through a variety of ways. So, for example, you begin by thinking about initial teacher education. What's the nature of initial teacher education? And what expectations should there be on those who come into the profession in the first place? How should they be trained? Who should do the training? And what should follow in relation to professional development? Well, the government is currently undertaking a consultation on the teaching standards, which are, of course, important for those who teach, but they are principally of use in determining whether you've met the threshold to become a qualified teacher or not. And that is being accompanied by a rethink of initial teacher education. And the Importance of Teaching white paper that was published last autumn talked about trying to ensure a greater role on the part of schools in teacher education. That's not to say that the higher education system will be out the game altogether. And that is not the Minister's intention. And in a sense, even if it was to be their intention, it would not happen for a very long time, given the contribution that higher education makes. And many of you in this room, I suspect, will be involved in a variety of different ways with higher education in preparing the next generation of teachers. So I think we'll be saying more about that. And in the light of the changes to student finance, there will be more said in the future quite soon about the incentives that might apply to attract the right kind of people into teaching. So in terms of standards, you have to think about the quality of the workforce. And in thinking about the quality of the workforce, of course, you then have to think about those that you're attracting into teaching. When it comes to continuing professional development, pretty much where we've been for a number of years, most of those decisions, if not all of those decisions, and most of the funding, if not all of the funding, is out in the school system. We really don't have much money left that is being centrally directed or targeted to promote continuing professional development. And that's very much consistent with what the Secretary of State believes. And certainly for some colleagues in the secondary sector, there was some controversy over the ending of the discrete funding for the specialist schools programme. The Secretary of State's view was, I've got no problem with schools wanting to pursue a specialism. I've got no problem with them using the specialism to as a sort of dynamic within, but I just don't think central government should be identifying a sum of money and saying you must use it for that purpose. Schools themselves will determine how to do it. I think there is an important development here in terms of current and emerging policy about the extent to which schools support schools. And this is an example, isn't it, this afternoon, of how you can create what some people call a self-improving system, where the strength of the system, you draw from the strength of the system to support the system. And the idea of teaching schools, got the terminology right, Steve? The idea of teaching schools being a kind of amalgam of the original teaching schools and the old training schools, yes, to play a role in initial teacher education, but also to play a continuing professional development role is important. But also just the choices that individual schools make, either to work with other schools or to access professional development support from individuals or people from the private sector or wherever, entirely up to them to decide. So that's an important feature. A very important, again, important distinction to draw is previous administration, as you know, placed a lot of emphasis, really from 1997 onwards, in the national strategies and quite prescriptive approaches to teaching and learning, which softened over time, but there was still, even by the closure of the national strategies, a lot of money being held centrally and put behind national strategies. This government's view would be these are professional decisions that should be made by head teachers and teachers, and it is not for the central state to be laying down large levels of prescription when it comes to the way in which teachers teach. So in some ways, the improvements to the quality of teaching, which are crucial to raising standards, are left to a very large extent with the profession, and the Secretary of State would believe very strongly that's where the decision making should be at school level. But of course, the curriculum is important in all of this, and therefore the changes, or the consultation, should I say, without preempting anything, the consultation on the national curriculum is very important. And here I think we do see some important difference between this administration and what it wants to do with the curriculum and the previous administration. Secretary has been very clear that he believes that there should be more rigorous content in the national curriculum, and in putting the national curriculum together, we should be benchmarking our content with the most successful education systems elsewhere in the world. And that's essentially what the National Curriculum Review team have been doing, quite literally been doing that. Been saying, okay, if you're going through the education system in Singapore, or you're going through it in Hong Kong, or you're going through it in Finland, or you're going through it in South Korea, what would you be learning if you were a 9-year-old in mathematics? What would you be learning if you were a 14-year-old? And really just trying to benchmark. I think you wouldn't be surprised to know that in many ways that's I use the word advisedly, an easier task to do when you look at maths and science than it is when you look at English, not least because of native speakers of English, your expectations will be different. But we're moving through that work, and quite soon, I hope before the end of July, we'll be able to put out really for a first look the draft programmes of study for English and mathematics. And I hope that will give you a kind of flavour of what the curriculum will look like. So the curriculum review is in 2 phases. We've got phase 1, where the 4 defined subjects are given and content is being developed, so English, math, science and PE. And also in phase 1, there will be, there is a consultation closed now about what the other subjects within the national curriculum should be. And that will lead to phase 2, which will be determining a similar sort of exercise about content and the other subjects of the curriculum.